In this session, we'll be talking about the former prophets. The former prophets consist of the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. So you'll notice that the books of Ruth and 1st and 2nd Chronicles are actually not included in that. They are going to be included, at least in the Jewish canon, as a separate group of writings. So we are just dealing with those particular books, and typically they are called the historical books. But in just a few moments, as I'll kind of go through some perspectives of reading these books, I'm going to suggest that we consider them as something other than just historical books. So we'll get to that in just a moment. The storyline in these books is the time from which Israel enters into the Promised Land under the new leadership of Joshua until the time that ultimately they're going to be the kings of Saul, David, and Solomon, and then a division of the kingdom. And then after a number of kings, both in the north and in the south, there will be literally the wiping out of the 10 northern tribes of Israel by the Assyrians in about 722 BC. And then the Babylonians will come along and they will bring great destruction to Jerusalem in 586 BC. And will take a number of people into Babylonian captivity. So this really significant part of the story of Israel happens between Egypt and Babylon. It is the story of the people actually being in the Promised Land from the time they arrive until the time that they are taken into captivity. So one of the themes that we'll see often throughout this will be the place where God lives. And you'll see, and you'll remember that all the way back in Exodus, God had given commandments to Moses about the construction of the tabernacle, directions for that. And God was a God who could move with his people, dwell among the people. By the time we get to Solomon, it's no longer a tabernacle. It is a magnificent and huge, wonderful, glorious temple that has been built. But yet when all of that story is done and the Babylonians come to Jerusalem, the temple itself will be destroyed. So this is a really significant time in Israel's story that asks some very difficult and challenging questions concerning God, concerning his people, concerning the nature of the relationship, concerning who has God, who controls God, if anybody. Have the people of God been eliminated, or has God changed his mind, or has he gone off and chosen another people? All of these kinds of things will emerge throughout these narratives. So what I'm going to do is offer 5 perspectives or ways of reading these particular stories. And in most cases, you'll be thinking through several of these perspectives at the same time. What I intend to do is to try to move the discussion away from the way that we typically approach these books, because we're used to calling them historical books, but we do so in the context of the way that we understand Western history, which is fairly linear. And we're going to try to begin to capture these books in terms of the more cyclical movement of Hebraic culture. So, for example, in Western history, we have a historical moment, let's say like 9/11, and we can pretty much in a linear fashion plot the storyline that moves up to 9/11, and then we can likewise plot the storyline that moves or flows out of 9/11. But we can have a fairly linear, continuous, well-documented telling or chronicling of that story. And then, of course, you could expand that much further on either end. In the Hebraic culture, things were seen more in terms of patterns and cycles, and some of the dissonance that Western readers like ourselves have when we come to biblical narratives is that we bring to it our Western understanding of history and the more linear approach of kind of connecting the events or the people, the movements, and places. So I'm going to list or name for you 5 perspectives. I'll just list what they are, and then we'll go back and just take a brief look at each of them and see how they might enrich or influence the way that we read the former prophets. The 5 perspectives we're going to talk about will be number 1, covenant history. Secondly, prophetic history. Thirdly, we'll talk about theological history. Fourth, we'll talk about complementary narrative. And fifth, I'm going to talk with you a little bit about progressive revelation. So let me go back up and let's start with covenant history. When we're reading this particular part of the Old Testament, we need to recall that we're doing this within the context of a covenant that God has already started. He has already spoken to Abraham. There have already been promises that have been placed forward. There's a covenant. He has already spoken to Moses, and there is a covenant. And so when we come to these stories of Joshua through the rest of the book of Kings, place them in terms of a God who has struck a covenant with his people. And the basic terms of the covenant are for the purpose of expressing the nature of the relationship and the purpose of the relationship. God is this kind of God, and he has this kind of relationship with his people, and because the people are in covenant with this kind of God, the people are of a certain kind of people, and there is a purpose of redemption and blessing in which God's going to seek to redemptively work and bless the world. So there is a covenant that is already a huge part of the story. And within these stories, you're going to be facing covenant kinds of themes nearly with every turn of the page. There's going to be even more covenant stuff, especially with King David. God is going to form a covenant with him, and basically that's going to consist of all of the stuff with Abraham and Moses. Now with David, the covenant is reaffirmed, plus there is now a kingship dynasty that ultimately culminates in a Messiah. So there is going to be a lot of covenant kind of things happening in these stories. So as you're reading through the stories, ever keep a mind on here's the covenant that has been made, and here are places where God seems to be coming back to this covenant, or he is furthering this covenant in David. And one of the things, too, that you'll certainly want to remember is How is the covenant put at risk when God's people are disobedient, or when a nation rises up against Israel, or when, for example, the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines? What does that mean for the people of God? Does it, for example, mean that God is no longer with him? Does it mean now that the Philistines have captured Yahweh, the God of Israel, and they are the new people of God in some way? So when you're reading through the stories, you're going to be ever confronting the covenant nature of these stories, and what is happening with the covenant, what is happening with God in terms of the covenant, and what is happening with God's people in terms of the covenant. A second thing to keep in mind concerning these stories, or a second perspective, is to keep in mind that this is prophetic history. We mentioned earlier that these are the former prophets that oftentimes are referred to by Western readers as the historical parts. And we're going to challenge that just a bit. As we've mentioned, there's the Western world and the Hebraic world have different visions of what history looks like, in ways that they see history, understand history, experience history, tell historical stories, and those kinds of things. It does not mean in any way that the stories that are told in the Hebraic culture or in another culture are not historical. It's just a way of affirming that the way historical stories are told are different than our kind of orientations and expectations. But this is prophetic history, not in the sense that things are being predicted, but in the sense that God is speaking. He is speaking to his people through various individuals, people like Samuel, people like Elijah or Elisha, and others. And so this is not just the telling of stories which are connecting the dots. This is told from a perspective in which God is in covenant, and the prophets, or those who articulate, or those who remind the people or challenge the people to remain in the covenant, or to live up to the terms of the covenant, or to be the people of the covenant. It is in this way that it is prophetic history. And so, again, while you're reading these stories, keep in mind that God is speaking, and he's speaking right into the very context. He speaks right into situations. He makes himself known and speaks right into particular historical dramas and unfolding of particular events. So keep in mind it's covenant, and those who give voice to the covenant are the prophets. Thirdly, this is theological history. In other words, this is not just history that is given in an attempt to be chronological, or an attempt even to be objective. It is history that is written from a theological perspective. It is a theological perspective in which God, in which Yahweh reigns. It is a theological perspective from which God makes a people, he forms a people, he has gathered a people, and he is delivering his promises and furthering his promises. And when you're reading these stories, you're going to, at every place in every story, you're going to be reading it in terms of the theology of which that shapes the story, and the theology that arises out of the story. Oftentimes this is missed. For example, People will be interested, let's say, in somebody like King David, and there'll be a tendency to want to perhaps do kind of a psychological analysis of David or a profile of David, and those things certainly might have insight and could be valuable. But the stories of David or the stories of Joshua are actually theological. They function theologically in the larger context of what God is doing. The central figure of these books is God Himself, is Yahweh. And sometimes it is tempting to get sidetracked or to get perhaps into some of the characters that maybe we're interested in or we connect with or we want to know more about, and begin to focus on the characters of those stories as if they were the prime character. The prime character is always God. That is a constant that never changes. It is God who makes covenant. It is God who sends prophets. It is God working redemptively in the world. And so as you're reading these books, put it on your radar and do this not only for these books, but for everything that you're reading in the Bible. The Bible is a theological book. And we've talked a little bit about this in our conversations concerning the book of Genesis, just beginning to understand and realize that when we come to these biblical texts, we are reading them as theologians, people who are seeing things, reading things from a faith perspective, and reading about a God who has entered into and is participating in and is completing and doing His work on the historical landscape and in the culture. So there is a lot of theological history that is happening. It could almost be said that in these books that history is theology. They are just so tightly integrated that you really can't separate the history from theology. The theology shapes the way these stories are told, and when your theological antennas are up and you come to this text, you'll begin to hear and see, read, understand these texts in terms of their theological frameworks and the theology that just arises out of the text. A fourth thing to keep in mind is the use of complementary narrative. And we'll illustrate this with the books of Joshua and Judges. When you read through the book of Joshua, and Joshua has just assumed the leadership from Moses, and now the story is moving forward, and the people are going to cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land. First of all, there will be a lot of echoes from Moses. So a lot of things that Moses did, like there's holy ground or the sending of spies or a burning bush, as compared to an angel that Joshua encounters. There are going to be a number of parallels at that point. But when you're reading through the book of Joshua, there seems to be a fairly orderly and systematic taking of the land. And at the second part, or in the second part of Joshua, the land is distributed to the tribes according to God's discretion, so everybody knows where to go. The land has been taken, and it seems as if in reading Joshua, the people have gone in. When they obey God, they take the land, and we have a couple of stories where there is disobedience. One of them I'll cite in just a moment. But for the most part, there are certainly challenges. The people take the land and they go to their appropriate places. When you read the book of Judges, the story is far more chaotic. There is far less structure and far less systematic in how the people take the land. And from time to time, the people are disobedient, and God sends a judge, which is basically a military leader who delivers the people. And they could arise in various tribes of Israel against various enemies that they encounter. But the basic pattern with the judges is the same. The people of God begin to complain or depart or be disobedient. Judgment of God begins to fall upon them. The people call out for a deliverer. God sends a deliverer. The people are delivered, and behold, the cycle begins all over again. The people are disobedient. Things get into a mess. They cry out to God, repent. God responds. There's deliverance, and then the cycle continues. So you're going to see this patterned cycle happening multiple times throughout the book of Judges, with the fact that the way the people take the land in the book of Judges just seems to be so very different in many respects than they did in the book of Joshua, which just seemed to be so clean and nice and easy to tell and neat. And now in Judges, there's chaos and there's confusion and there are judges and there's disobedience and repentance and all kinds of cycles going on and some fairly out there kinds of stories of what happens in all of that. This is a typical way that the stories would be told in an Hebraic culture. This we have really already seen in the Genesis creation story, where Genesis 1 tells the story of creation in a particular way, and Genesis 2 tells the story of creation in another way, yet they complement each other. We have the same kind of thing happening in these stories, and you can particularly see it in the way that we come to Joshua and Judges. They complement each other. One is told from one perspective of an orderly taking of the land, and then one is told from a more disorderly perspective, kind of peeling back some of the challenges and things that happen when the people do take the land. So this is not a case where you read Joshua and Judges and you have to decide, boy, which one is more closer to the truth. This is complementary narrative. They are both revealing divine truth. They're doing it in such a way that it takes both of them, reading each of them in their own context, in their own theological frameworks, for what they are, to be able to understand and to be able to get to the story of God and what He's doing with His people. The fifth thing is progressive revelation. Progressive revelation means that God reveals Himself appropriately in particular cultures at particular times, but in the context of that particular culture. So the way that God perhaps might reveal Himself in the times of Jesus or in the times of the early church will be different than the way He reveals Himself earlier in the story to Moses, to Joshua, throughout the stories to people like King David. And progressive revelation is very similar to relationships in our own contexts, When we meet somebody and looks like there's a potential relationship that might emerge or develop, we disclose ourselves or we divulge ourselves, we reveal ourselves in a progressive nature. We don't tell somebody everything there is to be told about us in our first encounter. That would be ruinous. And God does the same thing. He reveals himself in the context of the culture in which he is engaging. And this helps us. It doesn't answer every question. There are some things that are just left to mystery, and we simply will not know. But it gives great insight into some of the things that we do see in these stories. For example, one of the stories that happens is an early story, the taking of Jericho, and the complete annihilation of that city as the people of God advanced through it. That would, for most Western readers or most people on this side of Jesus, that might seem to be a very ungodlike thing to do. Or how do you reconcile a God who gives a clear directive to annihilate, to take out the city of Jericho, apart from Rahab and her family, and the God of the New Testament? Much of this goes back to progressive revelation. You don't see a story like that in the New Testament. So much more of God's character and his purposes have been revealed through time. But in the day in which that happened, that moment of revelation, or that point or part of revelation, was an appropriate expression for that culture and for the purposes of God's ultimate mission of redemption. So as foreign as that might seem to us, and as little as this might, explain everything, it does help us realize that God, supreme over culture, is also a God who engages, participates, gets involved in history, gets involved in our story, gets involved in culture, but he does so in ways that are appropriate for the particular culture in which he shows up. So keep in mind that we are, through these stories, we are watching this progressive revelation of God as it unfolds. It also kind of comes out in things like multiple wives. David, Solomon particularly, we might say, we might cast moral judgment on that and say, why wasn't anybody more forward? Why weren't prophets more direct in speaking to that particular issue? The reality is that in that particular culture, at that particular time, God revealed himself in ways that didn't focus on the multiple wives of people like David or Solomon. There were apparently greater issues to deal with, things like covenant, things like a promised land, things like just obedience in terms of covenant, things like being a blessing to the world. The revelation of God would certainly become more fully complete in Christ. But keep in mind that as you go back in time, and as we go back into the Bible and read these stories, the revelation of God is not at the same place culturally or historically as it is as the story of the Bible moves along. So some of these stories just that maybe causes us to cringe a bit or question things a bit, just keep in mind that God is working. He's revealing himself in a way that is appropriate for a particular time and culture. So I hope that you'll be able to kind of go over these 5 perspectives, and as you read through the stories and through the texts, that you'll be able to use these perspectives to help shape, to help inform, to help articulate your experience and your encounter with the former prophets. So I will look forward to our class discussion with some incredible stories that come out of this time period of Israel's story.